think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's Book Forum. I'm Brian Carney. I'm a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal. It's kind of nice that I get to stand up here and introduce Guy, because among Guy's many distinctions is an honor he bestowed on the Wall Street Journal Europe, where I used to be and soon will be again the editorial page editor. Guy wrote the first op-ed piece ever to appear in the Wall Street Journal Europe, and so his association with my paper goes back a long way, and we're very honored to have him as a contributor. And I'm honored to be able to introduce him because Guy is an extremely distinguished and remarkable man who has written a remarkable book that we're going to have the pleasure to hear him talk about a bit. Guy is a politician, a businessman, an academic, a writer, and an economist. Not only that, he's a French economist who strongly defends free markets. He's an ENARC, a graduate of the École Nationale d'Administration in France, which is the elite school for public administration, which has produced status by the truckload, but it also produced Guy Sorman. And his book is contentious but lively and extremely clear and well written, and it's a really remarkable achievement. I just wanted to I don't want to steal his thunder, but I as I was reading it, I got a copy a couple weeks ago. I was struck by the line. It's already on page 3 of the book, but it says, now there exists only one economic system, free market capitalism informed by classical liberal economic theory. This is a sort of shocking thing, I think, to say today. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it probably wouldn't have caught much notice, but we live in an age in which a lot of people think that the free market system has somehow been debunked by the events of the last couple of years. And this is an argument that Guy grabs by the lapels and really shakes into submission in this book. But I'll let him make the argument, and so I'm going to turn the floor over to Guy Sorman, the author of Economics Does Not Lie. There are copies in the back. If you don't already have one, I strongly encourage you to get one. Guy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. If you read the book, you'll miss the French accent. So this morning you have the book and the French accent. And as Brian just explained, the purpose of the book is to demonstrate that economics is a science and that free market works. And it is a science. It's quite a recent science. If we look back into history, you had extraordinary men who had extraordinary intuitions, like Adam Smith, explained more than 2 centuries ago that the free trade was good. But it was more like an intuition. What is quite recent in economics as a science is that most of our arguments, and certainly most of the arguments in this book, are based on facts that we can measure. We now work on data. We build mathematical model. We confront the mathematical model with economic reality, and we know if the model is right or the model is wrong. It's demonstrated wrong. We build a new model, and so on. So economics works as a science since quite a recent period. When I started studying economics and even teaching economics, it was very much a matter of opinion. People would think that free trade was good, and other people would think that free trade was bad. And some would advocate inflation as a way to create growth, for example. It was before Milton Friedman. And so it was a matter of discussion. And until the late 70s, economists would compare the efficiency of the Soviet model versus the capitalist model. And some would argue that the communist model was more efficient, more egalitarian. And because we didn't have the data, when we started having the data, economics stopped being a matter of opinion and it became a scientific matter. So when I say economics is a science and free market works better, it's not because it's my opinion or it's because it's my choice. It is a fact. And I would say most of the economists work now within this framework. So the role of economics and the role of economists today is to try to define what is a good economic policy versus a bad economic policy. So economics is a way to make the distinction. And I argue that we are today in a position to make this distinction. We know what works, and we know what doesn't work. Of course, what works doesn't work perfectly because we are human beings. And as human beings, we have passions and we make sometimes irrational decisions. And there are parameters that we do not control. But basically, within the parameter we control, we know more or less how to define a good economic policy. What is a good economic policy? A good economic policy is a policy which brings people out of poverty. And if they are out of poverty, which is the case in the United States or Western Europe, a good economic policy is a policy which improves the opportunities for people to, and more opportunities and more freedom of choice, as Milton Friedman said. So the criteria are very clear. So what works? Basically, six principles, and I have no time to elaborate, but 6 principles which will seem very evident today and which were not that evident, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. The first principle on which I think most of the economists today would agree, and beyond free market economies, that the root, the basis of growth is entrepreneurship. And without the entrepreneur, you have no growth. And you have entrepreneurs because you have circumstances, political and legal circumstances, which allow people to take initiative, like the rule of law, a reasonable tax system, and the respect of property. If you destroy the basis of entrepreneurship, and if you destroy private property, if you don't have a rule of law because there's a failed state or unpredictable state, and you don't have entrepreneurship and you have no growth. It is as simple as that. And this, of course, has been very often described, but more as an intuition than by facts. Now we have facts we can compare. We can compare countries where entrepreneurship has been destroyed by the third, in the name of communism, in the name of third way, entrepreneurship has been destroyed, rule of law has been erased, private property has been destroyed, taxes have been too high, entrepreneurship has disappeared, and as a consequence, you have no growth. The second principle, which is also extremely important, is the innovation. Innovation is the only engine for growth. There is no other engine for growth than innovation. So once you have said that, you have not gone very, very far. So you need to go a little bit further, like for entrepreneurship, and to try to understand what are the conditions for innovation. And the United States are a pioneer in innovation since more than 1 century because of a very specific conditions, which is basically the relationship, the close relationship between the university, the academics, and the business community. This is quite unique in the world. And if you look at fundamental research or fundamental science, you have other places which are as good at the United States, Europe and Japan, but there is no place where the connection between the business community and the academic community is as close, as narrow as it is here. And as long the United States will be able to keep this connection, this relationship between the academic world and the business world, I think the United States will be the leader in terms of innovation. Many other countries, France, for example, or South Korea right now, are trying to build this kind of connection, but it's quite complicated. It's rooted in history, in the culture of these people. So, I read all the columns and books about the United States losing its edge in terms of innovation. I see no risk there, as long you keep the circumstances which I just described. The third principle and I want to elaborate, is to have a stable and predictable money, a predictable currency. This is absolutely evident today. It was not the case. I mentioned that in my introduction. We do remember that in the late 70s, the Brazilian model, where it was explained and shared by many economists all around the world, that by creating more money, even through hyperinflation, you could bring faster growth. And this was a common wisdom, largely accepted, until Milton Friedman demonstrated it was wrong, and also until experimentation demonstrated that it was wrong. So economics, like any science, work on two legs, the fundamental abstract theory and also the verification of the theory. So this has been the case as far as inflation is concerned. And one of the most remarkable positive moves in 30 years is that most of the countries all around the world, they have created independent central banks. And in most of the cases, these independent central banks have been able to guarantee to the people that the currency would be stable and predictable. This is one of the reasons, for example, why many countries in Africa, which were mired into poverty, started growing. And real growth, and the main explanation has been the monetary stability. Before monetary stability in countries like Burkina Faso or Mali or elsewhere, people, of course, had no interest in investing in the future because there was no future. And since they have a stable currency, these countries, all conditions remaining the same, these countries started to grow because they understood the principle number 3. Principle number 4 is the free trade, all economists without exceptions, and I'm talking about economists, not about politicians, different job. All economists do agree that free trade is essential and is positive, so it has been demonstrated by theory and by practice. The question is, why is it that non-economists are still sometimes against free trade? It has to do with one of the characteristics of economics, and it has to do with also with the fact that economics is not a popular science. People do not like economists, and people do not like economics, and you understand why. Economists work globally. We say free trade is good for you as a group, for you as a nation. But if you happen to be a worker in an industry which will disappear because of Chinese or competition, to hear that free trade is good for you is completely irrelevant. And you have constantly this contradiction in economics between a discourse, which is a global discourse, free trade is good for you, and the individual perception of free trade which can harm certain individuals. This is why it's extremely important that the government or local or national government or whatever would take care of the negative consequences of free trade and other kind of economic modernization when they do impact individuals. And but there will be always this discrepancy between the global benefits of economic growth and the individual perception. This does apply to principle number 5, which is a destructive creation. To use the word of Joseph Schumpeter, destructive creation means that when an activity has become obsolete, irrelevant, it has to be closed, destroyed, in order to be replaced by something else. Okay, so in principle, it's like free trade, it's extremely efficient. In non-efficient countries like planned economy, no factories was ever closed. And this is why there was no growth in the Soviet Union, for example. But when you close a factory, this will show on television. Simultaneously, new factories or new activities will be created somewhere, but you don't know where. And therefore, there will be no television coverage. So creative destruction is like free trade. It creates an effect of asymmetry, and this explains why for politicians, columnists, pundits, it's easier in a way, beyond the fact that sometimes they do not understand the principle of economics, or they do not like it, which is a bit the same. I think when you don't understand, you don't like, but also it helps, if I may say so, that the negative aspects of growth are visible and the positive are not as easily visible. So this asymmetry, and Milton Friedman wrote a lot about this, explain why economics and free market economics is not extremely popular. What is extremely interesting, and I write a lot about this since many, many years, and this came as a surprise for many people, not only, even for economists. The big surprise since 20, 25 years is that the free market and capitalism work everywhere in any civilization. And this is not yet well accepted. I'll give you an example. Today you have many Arab or Muslim countries which are still very poor. Not all of them, but I'm talking mostly about non-oil producing country like Egypt. And you would listen many pundits saying, well, they are poor because they are Muslim, they don't have the right religion, and Islam is not stressing enough individual responsibility, or they think that everything is destiny. If everything is destiny, there is no reason to invest in the future. You just wait and see what will happen to you. And so this was the common explanation for the poverty of a country like Egypt. Like in the 50s, you had the dominant Max Weberian explanation saying that the Asian people, because they were Confucianists, they would never be able to grow because in Confucianism there is no interest in the future, and people keep repeating the same gesture. And what happens today under our own eyes, and it occurred in less than 25 years, is that when you apply the right economic policy, which happens to be exactly the same everywhere, okay, the five principles I quoted do apply everywhere, growth starts immediately and very rapidly. Egypt, I mentioned Egypt is growing, China is growing, India is growing. India is a very interesting case as well. When India became independent in 49, if I remember well, no, 48, right? In 48, the India chose an economic model which was extremely popular at that time, closed border, state controlling the industry, what was called the license kingdom. You couldn't start a new business, even a small business, without the state authorization. And this was supposed to bring India out of poverty. The growth rate of India between independence and 1991 was 1% per habitant. And this growth rate was so predictable, so constant, so regular, that economists starting in India called that the Hindu rate of growth. As if 1% was rooted in the Indian or Hindu culture. In 91, Manmohan Singh, finance minister, decided to open the border to welcome foreign investment to a certain extent, to cancel the license system, and India is growing between 5, 6, 7% according to the years. Okay, and I mention India because it's less known than what happened in China, and on which I will not elaborate. So one of the miracles, but it's not a miracle, it's just the application of sound principle and good economic policy, show that the culture, religion, civilization is not a key factor. The key factor is the economic strategy. It's good or it's bad. It goes into the direction of more free market or less free market, and this makes the whole difference. Now, if the system is so perfect and wonderful, why do we have crises? There should be no crisis, but there are crises, and they quite often, and they quite why? There are two reasons, I think. The first is a fundamental reason that the capitalism, free market, and growth follow cycles by definition. Why? Why can't we avoid cycle? I think it has to do with innovation. Growth is connected, as I said before, is based on innovation. But you can't know in advance whether an innovation will work or will not work. And sometimes innovation doesn't work. And when the innovation doesn't work, it brings negative consequences. So the cycle of the economy is very much connected with the technical cycle and cycle of innovation. If you don't have innovation, you have no growth. And if you have innovation, you take risks. As the French economist Benoît Mandrel-Braud likes to say, the market is a dangerous place to be. So the market is efficient, but the market is dangerous by definition. And among all the markets, the financial market is the most dangerous place to be. It is the most unpredictable of the markets because there is a lot of innovation going on in the financial market. Securitization, for example, has been one of the most remarkable innovations in the financial market. Not recently, it started centuries ago, but it becomes more and more sophisticated. So when you have innovation, you have danger. When you have danger, you have risk and you have cycles. So this is a fundamental reason. In the socialist economy or in the Hindu economy, there were no cycles. You could be sure that it was 1% a year. They would never reach 6-7% a year. Now they are, around 6-7% a year. They will have cycle, and they already have. Okay, so therefore, I don't think that you can eliminate cycles. You cannot eliminate cycles. What you can do is to help individual people to confront the harshness of the cycle. People lose their job, factories are closed, and so on because of the cycle and because of the crisis. So what is to be done is for a responsible government to take into consideration the hardship which is supported by the people and which is the consequence of the crisis. Okay, but to have a growing economy without any cycle seems impossible to me. Now, you have a second explanation, which is a short-term explanation. How do you explain specific crises? Not cycles in general, but specific crises. It's not that easy. There is still a lot of debate around the 1930 crisis, a lot of debate around the 1970s crisis. But my position, as I think many other free market economists will share this position, is that the root cause of the present crisis and former crisis, previous crisis, has been a loose monetary policy. It is very probably the excess of money available on the market which has brought speculation and bubble and the crisis after the bubble. And this is not a new phenomenon. In the economic history, we had a lot of bubbles. Most of the bubbles have always been the consequence of an excess of monetary creation. And the problem with the bubble is that they are very difficult to predict. And when you are in a bubble, it's very difficult to get out of the bubble because you don't know how long the bubble will go on. So it's good to be inside, because when you are inside, you make a lot of money. And if you go out of the bubble and the bubble still goes on, then you regret to have left, because others are still making money. And bubbles have been described through mathematical model. In my book, I describe at length the José Schenkman model. He's a Brazilian economist teaching at Princeton, who show how bubble works. And you are in a bubble not by looking at prices, but by looking at the number of transactions. When the number of transactions is increasing very rapidly, probably you are in a bubble. But at that stage, we can't predict how long will a bubble go on and when to get out of the bubble. And we can't because financial market follow the rule, and I will quote Mandelbrot again, of wild randomness. Financial markets are wildly random, and they cannot be otherwise, because if they were otherwise, they wouldn't be market anymore, because everybody would make money on the market. So financial markets are random by definition, like capitalism is will suffer cycle and crisis by definition. At that stage of our economic knowledge, we cannot do more. Then many people would say, many critics would say, but why do we need economists if they don't know how to make predictions? Well, first of all, in many sciences, we don't make predictions. But we can predict what is bad for you. I mean, we are like primitive medical doctors who tells you, well, if you smoke and you drink, probably you'll have a cancer and shorten your life. Economists would say, if you close your borders, like you did in the 1930s, if you print a lot of money, probably you won't be better off afterwards. The situation will be worse. And an Indian economist called Avinash Dixit, when he's consulted on the best economic policy for developing countries, sometimes answers, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. So we know where not to start from. We know what is to be avoided. We know what doesn't work. For example, to talk about the current situation in the United States and Europe, I mean, the stimulus doesn't work. We know that because it has been done before. So maybe this time it will work because we can't make prediction. So I cannot predict that the present stimulus will work or will not work. But what we can say is that in the past, stimulus never worked. And I won't get into details. We can demonstrate why it doesn't work. We can demonstrate in theory, but we can demonstrate also and as a practical matter because it has been tried many, many times. And so far, there is no case study to show that public stimulus works. It usually does not. Also, well, yeah, I wanted to say something about, because also today stimulus is promoted, regulation is promoted. I mean, so on stimulus, I'm very clear. On regulation, and I know Brian is more radical than I on regulation, because I say that regulation is usually useless, and they prove to be. And so if regulation are usually useless, deregulation is usually good. It has been demonstrated. Would re-regulation would be useful? It certainly would be useful for the regulators. Because a lot of regulation, but that's very important, a lot of regulation is justified, if I may say so, justified or legitimized by the political desire of bureaucrats and politicians to increase their own domain, their own power. You can understand that very well. We are all rational, or to a certain extent, but bureaucrats are rational as well. So you have to understand that bureaucrats will explain that deregulation is the origin of the crisis, even if this is not the case. Because I still don't see the connection between deregulation and the current crisis. But I'm more liberal than Brian because I say that some kind of regulation can be useful if they increase transparency. So my position is to say that a regulation would allow individuals to be better aware of what they buy, and would increase individual freedom, individual choice. The fear of Brian, sorry, I speak in your name, that regulators would use the argument of transparency to build more useless regulation. So it's always, economics is always about a question of fine-tuning and trade-off. And finally, I will repeat a story. Sorry, I told that I tried never to repeat myself, but you didn't listen to me yesterday night, and maybe you didn't read my latest paper in the City Journal. But I really love the discussion I had with the liberal economist Bob Frank at Cornell University, because you have this big debate about healthcare in the United States. And many liberal economists in the United States look at the French system and they love it. And Bob Frank explained to me why he loved the French system and why he would like to have the same in the United States. Because he goes to France every summer. And when he has a medical problem, or his children have a medical problem, they go to a French doctor. And they can freely choose the doctor, and it's very cheap, extremely cheap, and they're all happily surprised. And also they love the high-speed train. They love it. You know, they go from Paris to the Riviera in less than 3 hours. They love it. They say, we want that in the United States. And Frank says, well, you can't blame me for wanting the same as you have. And I say, but Bob, I pay for the high-speed train as a taxpayer. And I pay as a taxpayer so that you would access to a free medical doctor when you are on vacation. But if you were not on a vacation, if you were French, you would have half of your income used to pay for the train and to pay for the welfare system. Okay, and also the people who pay the most are the unemployed people. the cost of the French healthcare is so high that it does prevent the employment of a lot of young, unqualified people. So economics is always a trade-off. And you can't have both of the you can't have a perfect world with everything. You have to choose, and the role, the responsibility of the economist is to give the data, to give the figures, and to say yes, you can have a welfare system or healthcare system like in France, but you'll have on a permanent basis in good years between 10 and 12% unemployment, which what you have in the United States in bad years. That's what we have in the better years, okay? And when we have 10% unemployment, we're extremely happy. 10% means that 40% of the young people less than 25 are unemployed. But we have a high-speed train, and we have these wonderful medical doctors. So economics, fundamentally, economics is always about, it's not, I'm not a radical, I'm sure some people at the Wall Street Journal see me as a social democrat, and certainly that was the view that Milton Friedman had on me. I think that economics, you need clear principles, you need to know the facts, you need to work on data, but then it's all about fine-tuning, trade-off, and a discussion, and let the people decide through a democratic process. Thank you. So I understand you have some questions, or you don't?
There is a mic. Okay, yeah. We do have time for questions. There is a microphone going around. This is being taped, so please use the microphone, and please do identify yourself and tell us where you're coming from, so that the viewing audience at home knows who's asking the questions. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question, which is, Did we learn anything fundamental about economics from this crisis, or will we as we sort it out, or was all of this somehow already taken into account by the present state of knowledge circa 2006 in the science of economics?
Mm-hmm. It's a bit early to answer, but I think we haven't learned a lot. And when you talk with the academics, do they change the curriculum, for example? There is, strangely enough, it's a bit vain to say, well, nothing is really new in this crisis. It rather confirms a certain knowledge that we had. And people who share the view, for example, that in the excess of the loose monetary policy has provoked the crisis, this has been confirmed by the crisis. But I wouldn't say that there is a revolution in the knowledge of economics based on the crisis, at least so far. And even if you read columnists, very liberal columnists like Krugman, they are not bringing in new ideas. They want more of the same or less of the same, but basically we are still working within the same framework. And all the debate about this is the end of capitalism, this is completely irrelevant. There are no real new elements in this crisis. Maybe that's vain, but this is a present situation.
All right, yes, please.
My name's Daniel
Wait for the mic.
My name is Daniel Leger. I work in the hedge fund business. My question is about the form of regulation that you seem to subscribe to, about regulators increasing transparency. I wanted to know if you could comment on the decision about 10 years ago by Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers to prevent or to forestall the push by some regulators to have derivatives trade through market exchange. And they stood very firmly that banks were the best custodians of their own self-interest, and they could handle this. Do you think that was a mistake? What would you recommend in the future?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think it has be very helpful, to promote innovation in this field. I think that there is misunderstanding when you look at the crisis between the consequence and the cause. And once again, I think the real cause is monetary creation, loose monetary policy. And what has been done with this excess of monetary creation is only a consequence of the root cause. So, you know, there is an inversion in the relationship is reversed. And it's the same debate about greed, you know. When people say, well, the bankers or financiers have been greedy, this is a completely irrelevant argument. I mean, everyone is greedy. And if you have no greed in an economy, you have no innovation. So it's a kind of ideological interpretation or a moralistic posturing, but this has nothing to do with economics. And more generally, titrisation is good. And it's a very old tradition. It started a long time ago in the division of risks, and it has been extremely helpful. And I hope it will continue, and that new regulation will not stifle innovation in the financial sector. And also, many observers say it's too bad that in the financial sector, in other companies, I mean, the risk manager has no more power. But the risk manager have power. They have not been listened to because the opportunities, the possibilities to make a bundle of money were so huge that there was a disequilibrium brought into the system, not by the lack of regulation, but by the quantity of money which was available. So I better look, at the root cause than at the consequence, saying people are greedy, this should have been regulated. This comes only afterwards. And finally, final observation, when you regulate, I mean, the regulators will always be late vis-à-vis financial innovation. You cannot regulate what doesn't exist. So when you regulate what exists. And you are so, because of the lesson of the past, we'll have some kind of regulation based on what just happened. But what just happened will not repeat itself. Because in the coming years, you'll have new financial innovations. So the regulation becomes obsolete on the very day it is published. The regulator will always be late and will always run behind the market. So the argument saying that if we had better regulations, and by the way, if we had better regulators, and I don't know where you find them, no, but it's a real problem. Okay, the regulators, it's not the best people who become regulators. So regulators and regulation will always be behind innovation, except if they stifle innovation. Did I answer your question more or less?
Well, the question really had to do with market exchanges.
I know.
Trading derivatives, I mean, you don't have regulators telling people what products they can produce.
Yep.
You're just saying, you know what, we have counterparty risks here, and transparency through the market is a good thing. To me, it seemed like a market mechanism to solve a market problem.
Okay, I do agree.
Also, my name is Steve Hockman, Mediation Services. On the question of regulation, prior to the year 2000, virtually all of the states regulated insurance, and there were two key factors. One is, if you write insurance and you take in premiums, you have to set aside a certain percentage of the premiums you take in reserves, because theoretically and in reality, people are buying insurance to protect themselves against loss. And therefore, you can't treat all the premiums as 100% profits. That was number one. And number two, you had to have an insurable interest. I can't buy fire insurance on your house, or I can't buy life insurance on your life because I don't have an insurable interest. In the year 2000, Congress, at the obviously urging of the financial community, deregulated. They trumped all those laws with a federal statute which said, in effect, you can write credit default swaps, which is insurance, but we're going to say it's not insurance, and we're going to preempt all the states from regulating it and requiring reserves. And number two, we're going to also preempt the insurable interest rule that all these states have. So instead of, if you own some debt, like if Goldman Sachs has the debt of some entity and they're worried that they will default, they buy insurance. And obviously, they know their risks very well. They're not stupid. So they know there's a risk of loss, and yet AIG, who's writing all this stuff, basically assumes there is zero risk of loss because some made as instructed, what do you call it, AAA rating agencies said there's no risk of loss because they gave it a AAA rating. So isn't it the absence of getting rid of the regulations that made sense that really is very much behind what the crisis we're in now?
Nicole Gelinas will answer to you in her next book, which is to be published when, Nicole? November. And I don't want to interfere with her on the subject she knows best.
Yes, please, in the front.
I'm Steven Spruill with National Review. My question is, in your book, you know, the very first line is economics is a science, and you survey the current state of the field, and as you just said, if science is about making predictions from observations in the past, we've seen that Keynesian stimulus doesn't work, and yet a number of high-profile economists, certain columnists for the New York Times, persist in their belief that Keynesian solutions are the best way to address cyclical downturns. So what is the scientific equivalent of this kind of disagreement within the field of economics? Are Keynesians like flat earthers, or something less radical than that? What would you describe that disagreement as?
Well, they usually call themselves neo-Keynesian because they don't really follow what Keynes recommended in his time. Keynes was taking cycle into consideration, and in order to save capitalism, he thought that in good years you should have a budget surplus, keep the money, and in bad years you should spend the money. So what he was suggesting was counter-cyclical budgets. No countries has ever followed this Keynesian recommendation. The only person I know who recently came out again with this recommendation has been the German Chancellor. She said that in the future we should follow Keynes' model and have surplus in good years and use the surplus in bad years. So what neo-Keynesian advocate is a bit different because there is no public saving. So they just advocate pure deficit, and this was not part of the Keynesian agenda. In the short term, public stimulus may work. It does happen that it can create some kind of jobs in the very short term, but not for very long. Because the kind of investment where the state goes are investment which create jobs but which does not create wealth. And so they are not real investment with no return on this investment. Therefore, as a consequence, we know that sooner or later the stimulus is paid by higher taxes or inflation. In most of the cases now, because we don't have inflation, because of relatively independent central bank, it will be higher taxes, which will slow down the recovery. As you say, it's mostly columnists who are recommending this kind of public stimulus, or politicians. But among economists, I don't see many of them right now suggesting this kind of policy. I mean, no name comes to my mind, actually.
Yes.
And just if I may add, what is why would a political leader recommend job creation through public spending? Because he's on his own market and running for re-election. And so he must demonstrate that he's acting, and you are not re-elected by not acting, and also because he hopes that he will have kind of a short-term return, because the elections are always short-term. This is normal behavior in all democracies, and this is why, I mean, economists are playing their own role, is to say, well, maybe it can work in the very short term, but the consequences are negative in the long term, but we are only economists who are not running for office. And the people running for office, I mean, they can listen or not listen, they follow their own rationale.
Yes, my name is Kata Germani. I'm with Commentary Magazine. You quoted Mandelbrot twice approvingly in his characterization of the market and of wild randomness. Yet, in the beginning of your speech, you said that economics grounding as a science has been solidified by the availability of data and the application of mathematical and statistical models, which I would think Mandelbrot probably take contention with. Do you believe that, in addition to helping economists verify their hypotheses or check them empirically against reality, the reliance on, or should I say, over-reliance on mathematical models is a blind spot in the circles of academia and in economics, and it fails to take into account the wild randomness and the unpredictability of financial and economic cycles? And do you think it trumps sometimes common sense and a healthy account of human nature?
Mm-hmm. There are at least three questions in your question, so I try to make a distinction. Starting with the notion of wild randomness. What Mandelbrot says and tries to show is that in nature you don't have wild randomness, you have what he calls mild randomness. Physical events can be predicted to a certain extent. And he has built a mathematical model. I don't want to be too technical there. On the fractal model. Fractal models show that many chaotic events, like noise, for example, and do follow a mathematical pattern and can therefore be predicted. And the consequences have been extremely important, for example, in the telecommunication. So the Mandelbrot mild randomness mathematical model applies to nature and physical events. Okay? Chaos is not that chaotic. That's what he says. Then he tried, and many others tried, to transfer his model to the financial market. And when looking at the data, and we have data since the late 19th century, starting with the cotton exchange in New York, which are the oldest financial data which are available, it appears that no pattern ever appears. It's completely random. And any mathematical model which try to introduce kind of a prediction in the evolution of the prices and the market, all these models have been proven wrong, including many models which have been used these recent years, at least not to lose money. And so these models were attempt to predict the evolution of the prices. They all failed. And the conclusion of Mandelbrot is to say, at that stage, we have no mathematical tool or not enough knowledge to predict the financial market. Therefore, randomness is mild in the physical nature. In the financial world, randomness is complete or wild. This is what we know at that stage, okay? And, and I won't elaborate, but you have many mathematical models, I'm sure, which comes to your mind, which have been extremely popular until the recent stock exchange crisis. And these models proved not to be extremely precise. The second question is about the relevance of mathematical models in general. And do they take into account human parameters, human nature, and common sense? So the purpose of the mathematical model in economics is very limited, or should be very limited. There are a certain number of phenomena, certain number of parameters in economics which tend to repeat themselves. Like, very simple example, there is a mathematical relation between money creation and the level of prices, for example. There is a mathematical relationship between the level of wages and the rate of unemployment. There is a mathematical relation between the level of your education, what's called the college premium, and your chances to be employed or not to be employed. And this limited knowledge is built into mathematical model. This mathematical model have two virtues. The first virtue is that they introduce a certain amount of predictability. You know that you do this with a currency, you'll have that type of consequence. You know that if people go longer to college, probably they have a stronger chance to find a job, okay? And the second reason why mathematical models are used, it's because it's a universal language. And if you need to communicate with a French, a Chinese, or an Indian, you will speak mathematics and you are talking the same language. So mathematics are universal. So this is a rationale for mathematical models. But mathematical models, and you're right, they only represent part of the reality. And they used to be wrong. And following Karl Popper's suggestion, the progress of science requires that the model should be deconstructed and destroyed and proven false. I've seen in the way economics is taught in the United States, there is an abuse of mathematics and abuse of models. And many students in economic department in the United States think that economics is only about mathematical model. And this is absolutely wrong. Mathematical model is only one of the instruments that can be used to understand facts and what is going around and to make some prediction in certain cases. There is a lack of common sense in the education. Maybe this answers your question about what has changed and what should change. I'm very worried by the fact that that mathematics now is a requirement, and also that the history of economic ideas is not taught anymore in American universities. I think this is a big loss, and it reduces the scope and the knowledge of students in the economic departments.
Yes.
I'm Marshall Jaffe. I'm an investment advisor. I was intrigued by your definition or your yardstick for the success of an economic system as the extent to which it brings people out of poverty. And maybe this is not an economics question, but a political question. What do you think of the hypothesis that as a society prospers and its political leaders have less and less direct experience of poverty, that they also have less and less appreciation for the power of markets and capitalism to lift people out of poverty?
Well, the scope of the domain of economics is a limited domain. Economists are like plumber. If you want hot water, you better choose a good plumber. And I said to governments, I'm tempted to say, if you want growth, we can show you the way to a certain extent toward growth. So economics is basically about growth. And the question is, beyond your question, the question is growth a relevant criteria? And many attempts have been done by some economists like Amartya Sen, the Calcutta economist, or at the UN. At the UN, they don't like capitalism, so they try to build other instruments to measure the happiness of the people, for example, and trying to understand if happiness was distinct from economic growth. All these attempts have failed. It happens that growth is a synthetic factor, and that people tend to be more happy in growing economy. Because growing economy brings more opportunities and more freedom of choice globally. And now there is another debate, which is a relationship between growth and social justice, and the case of countries where growth is creating new inequality, which is the case of China, for example. But there is no connection between growth and social injustice. In most of the case, growth does bring more social justice. It doesn't bring necessarily more democracy, which is another complicated question. The relationship between growth, economic growth, and political freedom is not a clear connection. So your question opens so many fields that I can't focus only on one aspect of your question. I'm very sorry for that.
For perhaps the final question, yes, please.
Michael Kirkbride at U.S. Trust. You talked about China and India, chose to focus on India. I'm wondering your thoughts on China. If you think about your checklist of China's obviously running a tension between command and control in a free market. How does it stack up on your checklist, and how does that make you think about the future for their growth?
If I may quote myself, my former book was a book on China, published also by Encounter, and the title of the book of the Empire of Lies. And so to summarize my argument very shortly, and the factors of China has chosen to be a strong country, not a developed country. It's not the same. In a non-democratic country, you can decide to concentrate the investment on a narrow part of the country and a narrow part of your population, and make a distinction between what the Chinese leaders call useful China and useless China. Useful China is basically the eastern part of China, the part of China which is profitable because it is in a permanent relationship with the rest of the world. It is a globalized China. This globalized China is using the workforce of the peasants or not using the workforce of the peasants at all, which means that approximately 60% of the Chinese people are completely left out of the development process. This is a strategic choice. This brings so there are at least two risk factors for China, three even, I think. First one, when you leave out 60% of the people, even in a very repressive regime, you don't know what will happen in the long term. And we can see that these days. There is a huge risk factor because of this imbalance in China, and which is not the case in other developing countries like Brazil or India, where because of democracy, governments try to incorporate a larger number of people. So there's huge risk factor connected to the social division. Second weakness of China is a complete lack of innovation. China basically is an economy which is a subcontracting economy. If you have an iPod or a cell phone in your pocket, probably it's written on your cell phone on iPod. You can verify right now. It's written made in China. But in fact, the added value by the Chinese for an iPod is 5%. If your shirt is made in China, probably it's 80%. But for most of what we call made in China, the participation of China is no more than 5%. Because it is not an innovative economy. You cannot quote one Chinese brand. You cannot quote one Chinese innovation. Much is done and spoken about these huge new Chinese universities. I've taught in some of these universities. The quality is not very high, the level is not very high, and the best students usually will leave the country and try to go to the United States, Canada, or Western Europe. The Chinese leaders, they had a lot of despise vis-à-vis India, and suddenly India emerged in the software business. And they sent missions to India and trying to understand why there are there is Chinese software, Indian software, and no Chinese software. And they come back from India and they discover that there may be a connection between freedom of speech and innovation, especially in this field. But so far, they prefer no innovation and no freedom of speech. So I think the regime is not very helpful as far innovation is concerned. When the Olympic Games were, all these big equipments were built by foreign companies and foreign engineers and foreign architects, because the Chinese government didn't trust the quality of its own architect and own engineers. And third risk with the Chinese government is discovering these days how much they depend on the global market and how much they depend on the growth rate of the U.S. economy. And when the U.S. consumers stop buying Chinese product at Walmart, for example, because at Walmart everything comes from China, on the very next day factories are being closed in China and people are losing their job. So it's a very dependent economy. They are doing very well for 40% of the nation, because 20% are doing very well, 40% because you have a trickle-down effect, and 60% are completely out of the loop. So this is a system, and so it's very unpredictable, very dangerous. I very often say, if you're an investor, if you want to make money very fast, you go to China. If you want to make money for very long, you go to India. But you need patience, but it's less risky.
Thank you.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.